before I present the work, I just want to remind you that on October 4th, we have another guest, Yana, who's giving a presentation at Dinesen. So I'm sure you also have had one. And then on November 15th, with the local science trial, the social sociology trial, or a social psychology trial. He has published in the supplement social psychology and social psychology. He's, I guess, one of the rising star of social trust in the contemporary perspective. So, and he's also a very controversial individual. A week ago, his name was part of an article that was actually taken out of a newspaper. Too controversial. They misspelled his name, so the petition is like, but he's working on the topic. Very important. So here you have the to present the research, and after that, I'm sure we'll have a very interesting discussion about that and about other topics related to social trust that the audience might be interested in. So, Peter.
Thanks so much, Mark, and thanks so much for the invitation to be here at the CSDC. It's been a wonderful experience once again. Like Mark said, I was here 10 years ago, actually, so it's been a very nostalgic sort of visit back at the CSDC. I visited Dinesen, who was my host 10 years ago, and that was a very informative experience. It shaped my thinking on many of these issues a lot. And just, an overall great experience. I became good friends with Mark and other people here. So it's been very nice to be back, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I had a lot of great conversations with faculty and students, and it's been really enjoyable. So thanks a lot for that, and of course also for giving me the opportunity to present my work. This is actually not the title of the presentation as I think it's put in the program, because given that I have a little more time than I thought originally, I can actually sort of expand a little bit on my wider agenda. And this is basically the topic of a book that I guess I should say I'm writing. It's a little bit sort of anxiety provoking to say that you're writing a book, because that means that something has to come out of it eventually. But I'm writing a book on this, and it's basically wrapping up my work on the topic over the last 10 years or so. So some of the work that I was also doing here 10 years ago, and I wanted to sort of try to incorporate this into a broader, like a more general narrative, basically. So that I'll be talking about that, and I'll be talking about the specific paper on workplaces during this presentation. I'll embed that in your general presentation. Thank you, Mark, for taking out the steam of my joke. That was the only joke during the presentation, but I was going to allude to this op-ed in the Vancouver Sun, which apparently has actually had quite a lot of been given quite a lot of attention in the media and being accused of being racist and so on and so forth. So this is, I was a little nervous to speak here to this crowd today, but I mean, it's my impression that you're pretty open to the conclusions I'll present at least. Also, I had the resort that they actually misspelled my name, so it sounds like my evil Swedish twin. So I could also always sort of use that as an excuse if this was very unpopular. But anyways, at least at the very least, it shows that there's a big interest in this topic, right? And I think there's a good reason for that. And I'll come back to that in a second, why I think this is an important topic and why I think social trust is important in modern complex societies, such as Canada or Denmark or pretty much any other society, and why there might be consequences of ethnic diversity and immigration on social trust. Anyway, so the plan is the following. First of all, I'd like to flesh out how I understand the concept of generalized social trust, because I think there's actually a lot, I don't know how familiar you are with literature, but there's a lot of confusion around this concept in the literature, and I think it's extremely unhelpful and as far as I can, I'd like to try to at least clean this up and at least provide, I think, a consistent definition of generalized social trust, and following from that, also have some predictions about why it's an important trait in society and vis-a-vis cooperation. Then I want to speak very briefly about how social trust can be measured, because this is such a large literature that even this is actually attracted quite some attention. So I'll say a little bit about that. And then I'll move on to sort of the big question, which is whether social trust is actually threatened by immigration and the ethnic diversity that follows from it. Yesterday we had, in the workshop, we had an interesting discussion about, ethnic diversity and immigration. Are those two sort of different sides of the same coin, or are they actually potentially different? I'm mainly interested in immigration, and in the context that I study immigration, we typically see ethnic diversity following from increased migration. But I guess theoretically and literally, that need not be the case in all societies. But in my case, that's what I'm interested in. There's basically sort of two lines of work or two pathways that we might expect ethnic diversity, or potentially also more, but I at least want to theorize two pathways through which immigration might influence social trust. On the one hand, it might have to do with the trust that immigrants bring to their new country. And then on the other hand, it might also have to do with the encounters that the native-born population in those societies have with the immigrants. And this is what most of my focus will be on today. And it'll be specifically in the context of ethnic diversity in the workplace. So that's sort of a different context than most studies up until this point. Most studies are actually focusing on the residential context, and that might also have consequences for the conclusions that we've generated in this literature. And I'll say a little bit about that as well. And if we have time, I'm not sure we will, but if we do, I want to also show you a new piece I have, which is basically meta-analytical evidence on the relationship between ethnic diversity and trust. So it's basically a meta-analysis of existing studies of the relationship between ethnic diversity and social trust. All right, let's see. First of all, as I said before, I think it's important to explain what I understand, or how I understand generalized social trust. I basically understand it, and this is sort of along the lines of Rotter, the prominent psychologist of the 20th century. I understand generalized social trust as a generalized belief in the trustworthiness of, and this part in italics is actually pretty important, it's specifically trust in unknown others. So it's the trustworthiness of unknown others. It's not trust in out or in-group members, so we might call this a form of particularized trust. It's specifically trust in strangers, people that we don't know and that we don't have any information about. That's how I see generalized social trust, and it's this specific type of trust that I think is, I'm not saying that other types of trust are not important, they probably are. I'm just saying that I think this specific form of generalized social trust is probably the most important type of trust in society today. So it's basically what we could characterize as trust in the abstract other. How does trust work, or like what's the, why do we care to begin with? We care because generalized social trust is basically a belief or maybe a predisposition that influences decisions or behaviors that we make under uncertainty. So generalized social trust is a way to deal with uncertainty and risk. And you can illustrate this graphically. And the important aspect here is that we rely on generalized social trust when we make a specific trust decision. Should I borrow Mark money or not? Should I lock my bike? There's all these decisions that entail an element of risk that we make in our everyday lives all the time, basically. Whether we need to rely on our generalized social trust, so our general belief in trustworthiness of others, is basically a function of the level of information we have at our disposal when we make that decision. So generalized social trust is important when we don't have the information that enables us to make the right decision, so to speak. So when we don't have that information, when I don't know whether someone is credible or not, that's when I have to rely on my generalized social trust. So it's basically a disposition that predisposes us to be cooperative and act in a trusting manner in situations where we don't have information to otherwise navigate the situation with. If we have information about whether someone is trustworthy or not, then there's no reason for us to rely on this generalized social trust. So it's basically in all situations where we don't have that information at our disposal. So of course, in any given situation, you could imagine the level of information to vary. So sometimes there's a big element of risk, sometimes there's less of an element of risk. But basically, if there is a risk and we don't have the appropriate information necessary, we have to rely on the generalized social trust we have in the back of our minds. Okay, so this one. So why is generalized social trust an important belief that that influences how society works more generally. It builds on the assumption that is very well established that humans are basically what is called conditional co-operators, meaning that we sort of play the tit-for-tat strategy. We would like to cooperate and act in a cooperative manner, but only if the people we're cooperating with, in general terms, are also being cooperative. We don't want to be the only ones cooperating because that means we'll be the suckers, so we'll pay the sucker payoff. So we'll not actually be rewarded for those efforts. But we like to cooperate under the assumption that other people will do the same thing. So basically, one situation could be whether you want to pay your taxes or not. It basically depends on whether you think other people do the same thing. If you're the only one paying your taxes, it's going to be a drop in the sea. It's not going to make a difference. It doesn't make any sense to pay your taxes. If other people do actually pay their taxes, then you can provide public goods based on those monies. So it actually makes sense to act in a cooperative manner in this situation. Same thing with, let's say, recycling or other sort of collective goods that in the aggregate has negative consequences. If other people behave in the right way, so to speak, then you'll tend to do the same if you actually trust them to do so. And that's sort of the key function of trust. If you trust others to behave cooperatively, then you'll also tend to do so yourself. So it's basically important in all these contingent situations where our decisions, our actions are dependent on what other people do. And from that follows also that there's a lot of positive consequences of social trust for how society functions more generally. We're better able to engage in basically collective decision making, and also to think more long term in terms of instead of following sort of narrow self-interest. And that ultimately leads to a better government, and we can also imagine positive consequences for economic growth, because trust reduces transaction costs that can be very costly and therefore sort of dampen economic growth basically. At the individual level, same thing. We could also imagine that social trust could have positive consequences because it enables us to interact with others and potentially to reap the benefits of that interaction. Of course, that also presupposes that other people are actually trustworthy in that situation. There's a lot of really interesting research on this showing that generalized social trust is actually not the same as being gullible. It doesn't mean that you're naive. It basically means that under certain circumstances, this is a belief that you use to navigate social life, and it gives you the possibility for more interactions from which you can actually learn to decode whether people are trustworthy or not. I won't go more into that, but I think it's an interesting sort of line of research on this on the concept. Finally, I just want to mention that trust is also associated with a number of things that we generally consider desirable, subjective well-being and health and so on. It's very hard to say anything about causality in that case, but at least it seems to be part of a larger syndrome of well-being, so to speak. Anyway, so I hope I've conveyed the idea that social trust is important in the absence of information that we need for making decisions, and therefore it feeds into a lot of decisions that we make every day in society. Okay, so now to the measurement part, very briefly. Typically, social trust or generalized social trust has been measured in one of two ways, either through experiments or through survey responses. I think both are valid. They tend to, I think, tap into different things. The experiments tend to be this more like one-shot type of interaction, whereas I think survey responses under the right circumstances can tap into this more generalized belief that I was talking about. It's also useful, the survey responses are useful for gauging differences across individuals and societies, basically. So it's basically a very valuable indicator for comparing trust across different contexts. The most frequently used indicator of social trust is this one. I'm sure some of you have seen this one before. So we basically ask, generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted, or that you cannot be too careful in dealing with others? And this one comes with two response alternatives. Most people can be trusted, or you cannot be too careful. So this question has actually been criticized quite a lot. I have to say, I think this is generally not justified, and I'll explain in a second why I don't think this is the case. But two of the main critiques is, first of all, it's basically a very non-specific type of trust. It doesn't really specify what's the situation that you're supposed to trust in. And secondly, there's an unclear reference to most people. So who are most people, basically? That's not clear. And okay, fair enough. I think you could argue that those are valid critiques. I would probably say that I think this is a pretty valid indicator of this generalized expectation I was talking about before. Because, if it is such a generalized expectation, then you should not need to specify a situation. It's actually, I think, more valuable that it doesn't specify that situation if you want to get at that more generalized predisposition instead of a very context-specific type of trust. But say you drop your wallet in your neighborhood or something like that, which is another measure that's been used. So I think it actually taps into that well, and I think also by sort of using the terminology most people, I think is also justify. I think if you trust everyone all the time, that would basically conflate trust with gullibility or naivete, if you will. So I think, especially considering this question was formulated more than 70 years ago, I think it's incredibly fresh. Like, imagine how many survey questions just asked in the 70s, for example, that are completely meaningless today. I think this one has a lot of face validity in terms of actually picking up at least the concept that I'm interested in. I acknowledge that other people are different in other types of trust, but I think this one actually do correspond quite well to this generalized expectation that I'm interested in. Okay, so I hope I've managed to at least convince you that this has some merit to it, although I admit that it's maybe not a perfect indicator of what I'm interested in. Okay, so now let's get to the sort of the big question about whether immigration is then a threat to generalized social trust. This has been a big debate for, I think, at least 20 years, or at least especially the last 15 years. Basically, with Europe seeing, and also Canada and the United States seeing more immigration, this raises the question: okay, can these societies continue to cohere in the absence, like in the presence of more and more people being ethnically different than the traditional majority? So basically, trust as one sort of core manifestation of social cohesion. Can that basically be maintained when the populace becomes increasingly ethnically diverse due to immigration? As I said in the beginning, I think this could work, this hypothesis, if you will, could work through at least two channels, or there's at least two channels that I'm interested in. On the one hand, you could imagine that immigrants coming from typically low trust cultures, bringing that mistrust, so there's basically cultural persistence and mistrust, bringing that mistrust to the country they migrate to. And that would create pockets of mistrust in the destination countries, which might subsequently spread through interactions to the native-born population. And then, and this is what I'll be focusing most on today, there might also be, from immigration, we will see a higher number of interactions between immigrants, the newcomers, so to speak, and the native-born population. And the question is, do these interactions have negative consequences on both parts, but perhaps especially among the native-born population? And this is what the paper I'll talk about today will mainly go into. Okay, but let me give you a little bit of evidence on the first pathway, because this is what I've been doing work on for, previously, and then I'm sort of getting back to this research again. And in a sense, you could say studying trust of immigrants is actually a very strong test of, I would say, the two most generic classes of explanations of where social trust comes from. Namely, on the one hand, is this a product of culture, which is basically the idea that you're socialized into a culture from early on, typically from your parents, but also from other agents, and then subsequently in life, trust basically doesn't change, right? So trust is basically something that's set in stone from an early age, and not something that's likely to change with experience over time. So this is what we could call cultural persistence, basically, and that of course predicts that when migrants from low trust countries migrate to a high trust setting like Denmark or Canada, for that matter, that would entail that they would sort of hold on to the mistrust from their home country, from the country they were born in. And maybe they even give this on, they pass this on to their kids and so on. So you can see how that would sort of be reproduced over generations. The other alternative explanation, which I might say already at this point that I'm sort of a proponent of, is what we can call the experiential approach. So this basically predicts that people, and including immigrants, tend to update their level of social trust over time with the experiences they have. Not from day to day and from experience to experience, but over time, there tends to be a slow adjustment in trust, towards higher or lower levels, depending on what you actually experience in the context you're in. And from that perspective, you would imagine that immigrants migrating from a low trust country to a high trust country, that would ultimately over time give rise to a number of positive experiences that would then manifest itself in ultimately higher levels of trust in other people in general. So that's more like the context / experiences shaping trust approach. And we might label that the experiential approach. So we could basically test those two approaches by looking at immigrants. Do immigrants tend to resemble the level of trust in their home country, or do they rather tend to resemble the level of trust in the country that they have migrated to? And quickly, let me show you evidence from a couple of studies I've done on this. Here in this paper, I basically matched immigrants from Turkey, Poland, and Italy in high-trusting Northern European countries to basically their former compatriots, so people who are still living in their home countries. And of course, this is not an experiment, and I've only tried to sort of conditioning on covariates, but ultimately what it suggests is that trust to be substantially higher among Turks living in Germany than Turks living in Turkey, for example. Same thing with Poles and Italians. So this indicates that, taking these various factors in potential confounders into control, there is actually a context effect. So when you live in a setting where trust is higher, that tends to rub off, and we can think about why that is, but and I'll come back to that. But basically, there's a tendency for trust to rub off. So trust spreads basically from the experiences you have in the setting that you migrate to. I should say at this point, there's not a perfect adaptation. So levels of trust are still slightly lower than among the native-born population, but it's substantially higher than trust among the population in one's ancestral country. Here's a more sort of, I guess like a more broad-based perspective on this. It basically looks at the relationship. This is in a multivariate model, but it basically looks at the relationship between the aggregate level of trust of natives in a given country, and then the average level of trust of immigrants in that country. And what we see is there's a very tight correspondence, meaning that immigrants who live in high-trust countries like Denmark or Sweden, they also tend to be much higher trusting themselves. And vice versa, if you live in a low-trust country as an immigrant, for example, Greece or Italy, you also tend to be much lower trusting yourself. Of course, this all raises questions about sorting. Is it sort of high-trust immigrants going to one country or another? It's hard to rule out completely, but I still think this is indicative of this experiential or contextual effect that I was talking about. That basically people have experiences that ultimately lead them to update their level of trust and therefore become more trusting when they're in a more trusting setting. One, I think, fair theoretical critique I received when I first presented these results were that, okay, so you've shown that people from low-trust countries become more trusting when they migrate to high-trust countries. This is, of course, by far like the lion's share of the migration we see in the world, but we do also see, theoretically, it's interesting to ask if it's sort of symmetrical. So if people migrate from a high-trust country to a low-trust setting, do they then become less trusting? I think this is harder to test because I think if you migrate from a low-trust country that also tends to be more affluent and so on, then there's probably, I think, a higher risk of sort of self-segregation in the new country. But we actually did try to test this using data from Swedish migrants or expatriates, if you will, identified in the Swedish tax registries. So we basically look at, in this analysis, people who migrated to different regions of the world the year after they migrated. And they are basically on a par. They have more or less the same level of trust. If we then look at people who've been away for a long period of time, 45 years in this case, we do actually see there's a tendency for those living in the Nordic countries that are the most trusting in the world also tend to be the most trusting Swedish expatriates. And those who live in former communist or African and Middle Eastern countries tend to be substantially and significantly less trusting. So there does seem to be some indication of the experiential perspective also going on in this case with immigrants from a high-trust country. But I guess the same problem, of course, remains with this could potentially also be selection explaining the pattern. Okay, so in conclusion, we basically see that there's stronger support for the experiential adaptation perspective. Immigrants tend to overtake or take over the level of trust in the country they migrate to. There's also some cultural residue, so to speak, meaning that there also seems to be some effect of the ancestral country, but in the aggregate, the effect tends to be stronger, sort of the experiential perspective. And this raises the question: why do immigrants become more trusting? I've done some research on this, a bit at least, and institutional fairness appears to be important. So the idea is basically if you have experiences with various representatives of the states, bureaucrats, doctors, teachers, etc., and those tend to be positive and basically indicate that the state functions in a fair manner, in an impartial way. That sort of sends the signal that people tend to, in general, to be trustworthy, and it also indicates that not acting in a trustworthy way is not an optimal strategy for people. So in general, people are basically disincentivized from acting in an untrustworthy way. So my claim is basically that if you migrate to an incorrupt society, that would ultimately tend to increase your trust, because you basically learn that trust is the modus operandum of this society, and you also learn that it doesn't pay off to act in an untrustworthy way in those societies. Okay, so this was sort of the first pathway, and this is actually not what I'm talking about today, but I just wanted to give you that perspective as well. Now I want to move on to the other side of the coin, or the other pathway, which looks at whether native-born individuals are influenced by being exposed to or experiencing immigrants in various social settings in their society. And of course, there's as I said before, there's a huge literature looking into this. This, I would say, is probably one of the the very debated questions around immigration in general. And I think the essence of this is basically whether, when you experience, or that whether you're exposed to or actually have contact with immigrants in a social setting, how does that shape your attitudes more generally, and in this specific case, how does that influence your trust in other people in general? Especially Putnam's study from 2007, which I'm sure most of you know, which was very controversial, really sort of, I would say, gave even more interest to this debate, or really made this a very hot topic, and there's been a wealth of studies basically looking into this question after that. I think overall, and I can actually back this up with data, but generally what we see, there is a negative effect. It's not super strong, but it's generally there. Ethnic diversity measured in different ways on social trust. Okay, so let's think about why is it that there might be such a negative effect. This is actually not super well theorized, and I'm not sure if I have like the exact solution myself, but I think this is something that's worth thinking about more. Where's the actual mechanism going on? I think the way I think about it is that, so as I said before, I have my roots in the experiential tradition, meaning that I think that people, to some extent, base their estimate of other people's trustworthiness, their expectations about other people's trustworthiness, on the experience that they have. If you live in a neighborhood with more immigrants, then you have more interactions or experiences with an outgroup, basically. Because people tend to have, partly socialized, partly maybe inherently, having these outgroup biases where they tend to be slightly more negatively inclined towards people who are identifiably different. And of course, ethnicity is a cue of difference. Then that means that these people have, I would say, micro cues every day about being exposed to someone who's slightly less trustworthy, and then that affects their overall estimate of how trustworthy people are. I don't expect this to have a massive effect, but I think this is something that people basically pick up in the grind of their daily life, that they basically expose people that they think of as slightly less trustworthy. And that influences their overall estimate. Right. I also want to highlight another thing, and it's something I thought more about recently, and maybe this is a subtle contrast, but typically this relationship has been explained with groups of, theories of group threat from social psychology, or something what's labeled conflict theory, which is more or less the same thing. And that is sort of a theory that tends to sort of put a lot of emphasis on specific group relations, and also the competition between the different groups. I actually don't find a lot of evidence to back this up. I think also because this is much better suited to explain relationships between groups instead of a more generalized phenomenon such as generalized trust, at least as I have defined it. So at least in my account, it doesn't presuppose that there's any necessarily direct competition going on. It's simply the fact that you're being around people that you tend to think of as slightly less trustworthy than your co-ethnics, basically. I think this is also broadly in line with Ehlers, for example, the way he thinks about these contextual things. Yeah?
Yeah, I think anecdotally, like in rural regions, maybe there'll be more bias against outgroup members than in urban regions. So how can we match that up with your account here? How come people in cities will tend to be more trustful of immigrants when they're often in contact with them, while people in rural regions would tend to not be? Yeah.
This is a good question. I think I have a partial answer for it, which is selection. But there's probably more to it than that, right? In a sense, I'd actually like to go back to it later if we can do it, if it's okay with you. Do you want to do it in the Q&A? Because then I'll partly get into this here at least. But okay, so this is sort of one account of why we might see this negative relationship. And what is actually the case? Like, so what does the empiric show in the case that I mainly study, namely Denmark? In a sense, we could sort of stop the talk here and already get the beers, because this is showing the relationship. I don't know why this doesn't work. I'll try shifting the value. This shows the relationship between share of immigrants in Denmark and the level of trust measured by the columns question I showed you before. And it basically shows that from 1979 to 1980, where Denmark was a very homogeneous place. This is annoying. So basically, what this one, and you can try to study it while I'm trying to fix this. This basically shows that Denmark used to be an extremely homogeneous country, and now it's become considerably more ethnically diverse over the past 30 years. And in the same period of time, trust has just gone nothing but up, right? Like I don't know why this doesn't work. So we see trust basically going from around 50% trusting others in 1979. That was still a relatively high level of trust on a global scale, to actually 79% trusting others in 2009. That's
Just what do you call ethnic diversity is a different measure than
right.
representation of immigrants. How this is it concerned? So in a sense, a census where they ask people.
So these are census. Well, it's basically it's basically in Denmark we have these administrative data basically, where you have I would say like very valid data on, because everyone's registered by where they were born and where the parents were born and so on. And there's more or less complete data for the population. You're right. This is immigrants, so it's not the same as ethnic diversity. It's very, very highly correlated. So I mean, in practice it would be the same thing. But this is the share of immigrants basically. But anyways, so what I'm trying to say is that we've gone from being very homogeneous to being considerably more ethnically diverse. And at the same time, trust has just increased markedly. And this, around 80% of people trusting others is actually the highest level of trust that I've seen in any measure ever, basically. So in a sense, you could say, okay, doesn't that solve the question? There's no negative effect of ethnic diversity. It's not so simple, and I'll come back to that in a second. But of course, it does indicate something pretty important. That at least as it is now, there's no indication that trust is like a real threat to social trust. There might be, ceiling, like basically like cutoff effects and that kind of thing, threshold effects. But at least at this point, trust is very high in Denmark, and we're more ethnically diverse than we've been before. So this provides a whole very important piece of the puzzle of this, and everything I say from here should also be sort of seen in contrast, or seen in relation to this specific measure. By the way, just as an aside, this is an illustration of the level of trust in different countries from around 1980. And pretty interestingly, you see that trust in Denmark, but also partly in the other Scandinavian countries, have really increased, whereas it's famously decreased in the United States. This is this one. It's because this one doesn't work. So actually, Scandinavian countries have experienced an increasing level of trust. I also put in Canada here, and you guys are also a high trust country in general, at least sort of on a global scale. Interestingly, when you split this up on Quebec, you see in this year that Quebec is much lower, but it's actually higher in 2006. And I'm not sure why that is, because people always say that the trust is lower here than the rest of Canada. But actually the data, at least in this specific data point, which is some years back, it actually doesn't show that. But anyways, I'm happy to talk about that also afterwards, because I actually find that interesting. But anyways, that's just an aside, showing that there are actually quite different trends in trust across societies. Okay, so this is coming back to what I showed you just before. So we see that trust has increased with immigration, but, and there is a but, when we analyze this across municipalities, we can see that municipalities where there's been higher immigration, or which are composed of a higher share of immigrants, so if they're more ethnically diverse, if you will, they also tend to have lower levels of trust. And it's a quite strong, robust relationship, basically. So there is a negative relationship at the municipality level, indicating that in municipalities that are composed of more immigrants also tend to have, on average, lower levels of trust. And this is not only an artifact of basically them being composed of more immigrants, because immigrants have lower levels of trust. That's the pattern you see. It's also because natives have lower levels of trust in those municipalities. So I think the more correct interpretation is probably that there is a negative effect, a limited negative effect of ethnic diversity or immigration on social trust, but it's clearly overridden by other more important forces that pushes trust up further. Okay, when you see this, I'm sure you have a critique, which would be a fair one. You would say that, okay, we don't know these municipalities, but they're probably super aggregate. They're pretty aggregate context, which is fair. They are quite aggregate, so it's, I think, on average around 20,000 people. So they're pretty imprecise measures of what people actually experience in the local surroundings. And if we took my argument seriously from before, then we actually need to know what people are basically exposed to in their everyday lives, and we have a very rough proxy for that. We can imagine the estimated relationship to vary in all kinds of unpredictable ways. We could, for example, and this is actually reality, we could have a situation where there's a lot of segregation in some municipalities. So, for example, the most ethnically diverse municipality outside of Copenhagen also has areas, famous areas that are more or less exclusively inhabited by Danes or native born Danes. So this is a real possibility that might actually basically confound the relationship that we're observing. And this is also a point Dinesen has made in some of her work. So basically what we want to do is that we want to measure immigration or exposure to immigrants or ethnic diversity in a much more local way, where we can be certain that people are on average over an extended period of time exposed to people of different ethnic background. And this is what I've done in some of my previous work, basically what we might call a micro-contextual approach. So what we do is through the Danish registries and the administrative data, we link the survey responses to the registries, and that means we can identify as people's ethnic background. We can also identify where they live and who lives around them. So we can compose basically very, very precise measures of your very micro-local context, basically. We call it the micro-context, and we basically go down to a context of within a radius of 8 meters of where people live. So the argument is basically that if you measure trust or if you measure ethnic diversity so locally, that means on average you will be exposed to people of different ethnic background, as opposed to in municipalities and more aggregate units where you can more or less have a complete segregated life. That's simply not realistic if you live so close to them. So this is what we did, and we argued this is a quite strong test of whether this actual exposure or visibility in everyday life of immigrants is actually what is triggering the effect. And what we see here is, I think interestingly, that when we measure concentration of immigrants or ethnic diversity or another diversity measure in the very local context, this is when we observe the negative relationship. When we zoom out, even just a little bit, even just within a radius of around 1,000 meters, which is not that aggregate on a sort of compared to how many studies do this, then we actually see the effect, and this is plotting the effect or the estimated relationship. Then the effect basically goes to zero and hits zero ultimately with huge standard errors. Meaning that in the local context where we know that exposure is more or less unavoidable, at least over time, that's where we see the negative relationship controlling for all sorts of potential confounders. It's not experimental, of course, but still, this is basically what other people have done in other contexts. This indicates that there is this negative relationship and maybe even the negative effect of living around war immigrants in your very local neighborhood. And when you zoom out and just have slightly more aggregate measures, you don't see any relationship. So I think this is an indication that there are negative effects of residential diversity on social trust. Okay, at this point you might add another critique or another reservation, which would be that, okay, maybe we buy your result, but isn't you only tap into one certain aspect of the encounters, the interactions between immigrants and native-borns, namely what we might call exposure. It might just be me observing people who look different from myself, and I'll stand over here with my hold on to my stereotypes. I actually don't have any meaningful contact. And I think this is a fair critique, and I think also one you've made, Dinesen, basically saying that this is not a complete characterization of how people actually encounter diversity. This is only sort of a one-eyed view of that. And because we've studied the link between diversity and trust overwhelmingly in diverse residential settings, because residential settings do not necessarily actually give way to meaningful contact where people can actually sort of build a more sort of friendly and extended relationship, then we might actually end up giving a biased portrayal of the relationship between ethnic diversity and trust. And this, of course, also basically comes from Allport's famous contact hypothesis. And you could say in this case, it's basically an expanded or extended version of that, because Allport was, of course, interested in stereotypes about outgroups. And he said that meaningful actual contact over an extended period of time where people have the chance to get to know each other and work together, that would ultimately reduce stereotypes. So maybe you could make a similar argument, at least that's what's been done in literature, to say that maybe this even generalizes to trust in other people in general. So maybe it's not only the specific outgroup in question, it might also generalize through, for example, processes of secondary transfer, where that kind of contact effect also generalizes to other outgroups. So maybe it even extends to people as a whole, to like, our expectations about generalized other, as I spoke about. So that's one argument we could make, and basically saying that if we study the relationship between ethnic diversity and trust in circumstances where contact is more likely to occur, or where it might occur, we know that it occurs, then we might actually see a different relationship, and this might actually give a more balanced portrayal of the actual consequences of ethnic diversity and social trust. Okay, so how do we do this? So in the actual paper that I'm finally getting to present now, we argue that the workplace is actually a good setting for studying this question. Because I think for most people it's probably one of the most important social contexts they have, apart from probably where they live. But it's probably one of the contexts where we spend most time, basically. It also seems likely, in my opinion, that the workplace context approximates the conditions that are set to further contact effects. You're likely to have extended, repeated interactions with your colleagues. At least some of the time they are probably collaborative, and also sometimes it's between people of equal status. Maybe these conditions are not all fulfilled, but they are certainly, I think, closer to being fulfilled compared to the residential context. So we argue basically that the workplace is a good setting for studying. We call it a contact-prone context. Why do we do that? We do that because, contrary to what a lot of the literature does, and I'll actually show you why this is the case, it's problematic to measure contact based on survey measures, basically asking people if they have friends or talk to people of different ethnic background. Because there's a lot of, I think, self-presentation involved, so you have a strong sort of incentive to present yourself in a tolerant way, for example, or maybe even the opposite. The point is just that this is going to influence your answer to that question, and ultimately that'll influence your relationship with generalized social trust. That's also measured in the same question here. So I think due to that, it's much more productive to basically study any diversity measured using administrative data, which are then decoupled from the survey that we're linking it to, in order to understand the relationship between, in this case, workplace context and ethnic diversity. So I admit it's a contact-prone context. We cannot know for sure that contact actually occurs, but I think it's likely. And I also show you some data that indicate that this is the case. Okay, so this is what we try to do in this paper, and we also try to use some more sophisticated research design to pass this out. So finally, I'm getting to all right. So, but I can skip a lot of the introduction because I already went through that. All right. So we studied this in the Danish context, workplace. So it was another study from Denmark, basically. And of course, one of the neat things about the Danish case is not so much Denmark, but the fact that we have, under certain circumstances, linkability of the survey data with trust to administrative data on the individual level, meaning that we can, as we could with the residential context, we can construct basically the ethnic composition or any other social demographic composition of specific workplaces that people work in, because we also have identifiers for workplaces. And not only workplaces, but also specific work sites. So, you could be in a big company having multiple branches or sites across the country, but we start studying specific site, again indicating this is where they're likely to have actual contact. We rely on European Social Survey round 1 to 5, and from that survey, we have a follow-up panel data from the first and the fourth and 40% of the second round. So there's basically a panel created based on the European Social Survey, based on different rounds. So that means there's also different time intervals between the first and the second wave of the panel. Yeah, so again, because we have these administrative population data, we can calculate objective measures of workplace composition, including on ethnic composition. And this is actually, I think, a big quality because it means that we can avoid some of the measurement error that are involved with using subjective measures. For example, social desirability and other perceptual biases that might influence relationship and trust. Okay, in this analysis, we only focus on natives. There's only a small number of immigrants in the sample, but when we also include those, it doesn't change the result, just so you know. Okay, we use the classic social trust. So in addition to the one I showed you earlier, the classic social trust scale includes 2 other questions regarding people's fairness and helpfulness. You can argue back and forth about whether they should be added, but at the end of the day, they're relatively highly correlated. Ethnic diversity we use in broad terms, so we speak about this in broad terms as it has been done in literature in general. So that means we're both talking about concentration of immigrants, concentration of non-Western immigrants, that's the most salient distinction among immigrants in Denmark, and we're also looking at the Herfindahl fragmentation index, or fractionalization index. It doesn't change the result is basically the same for all these because they're very highly correlated. And that's actually a more general point in literature. It's more or less impossible in almost all settings, maybe not in Canada, but more or less all other settings, it's impossible to basically differentiate these 3 things. They tend to pick up the same thing. We include some control variables. At the workplace level, we, I think importantly, include the average level of education, so there's a high skill or low skill workplace. We also include the number of co-workers. And at the individual level, we include very classic socioeconomic status variables. We also include the sector, which I think is important. Survey dummies, and in robustness checks, we also include life satisfaction. We use OLS regression at the cross-sectional model, and then we also have panel data where we use fixed index. And this two-way setup is the equivalent to the first difference model. All right. First, let me just validate my point from before, because in one of the follow-up panels, we actually asked people, those who had friends, how many of those were colleagues and co-residents? 41% indicated that of their friends, some of those immigrant friends were colleagues, and 24% reported that some of those were neighbors. So that's at least an indication that we cannot know if this is more likely to emerge in the workplace, but it indicates that there's a high likelihood of people actually developing friendships in the workplace than it is in the neighborhood. So I think that validates that assumption somehow. We also see a strong relationship between the propensity to have friends of immigrant background and the ethnic composition of the workplace, and similarly for the residential context. Okay, so these are the first cut of the baseline models, basically. So this shows the relationship between ethnic diversity in the workplace, measured in these 3 ways that I just mentioned, and in different specifications. This is the bivariate model. This adds individual controls, and this adds workplace controls to model 2. And as you can see, it's a very consistent result. There's a negative relationship, indicating that we don't actually see the contact effects emerging. We see the exact same pattern as we did in the residential setting. We see the negative relationship, basically. And it's consistent across all measures. It's hard to compare the effect sizes because they're basically measured on different scales. But anyways, we see consistently the negative relationship. Okay, now I showed you earlier the negative relationship at the residential level, residential context, and now I showed you the workplace context. This might lead you to raise the question, okay, but are they actually picking up the same thing? Do people work in the same context where they live, or at least a correlated context, so to speak? Are they just measuring something, underlying more diverse, so it's actually not contributing new knowledge in a sense? I think that would be a fair question. Yeah, okay, I should have gone through this one. Okay, this one basically looks at differences across sectors, and it shows that there's no systematic difference across sectors. Because my one concern would be that, is there a tendency for, in certain types of sectors, people work together, in other types they don't. Maybe they're cleaning by themselves, and others they might more actively work together. By conditioning stratifying the effect on, subsetting the effect on sector, and not observing any systematic differences, this doesn't indicate to be the case. So it seems to hold up through sectors, basically. And then what I was talking about earlier, is it basically the same thing? Do we basically see the residential workplace, the residential context and the workplace context picking up the same type of diversity? In order to address this, we included the micro contextual residential measures and also municipality fixed effects to the model. So this is a quite restricted model in this regard. And basically we see exactly the same result. So this adds the neighborhood controls, this adds municipality level fixed effects, and this adds both. So this is even, controlling for the residential context only within the same municipalities, because it's municipality fixed effects, and we see the same result. Okay. I think I'm going to take a little bit of water. Also, as I noted before, we actually have panel data, and this is think, an important improvement vis-a-vis causal inference. What I've shown you up until now has basically been cross-sectional data. We all know the obvious problems with using cross-sectional data to make causal statements and causal inference. It's not that we can sort of rule that out completely by using panel data, but we can rule out some of the likely confounders. So basically, by analyzing the relationship between diversity and trust within individuals instead of between, we can rule out all fixed characteristics of individuals, basically. So that could be personality or whatever deep-held biases you might have and so on. So this is, I think, is actually ruling out some of the relatively likely confounders that we might expect to operate and confound the relationship that I showed you just previously. So therefore, we analyzed this within individuals using individual fixed effects. The problem of that approach is that this is generally a very conservative approach or estimator because it only uses, yeah.
I'm just quite confused because in the previous papers, you said that you were using a first difference model, right?
No, that was for this paper.
For this paper, you're
Yeah,
using a first
and I said it's the same in this specific two-way effect case as the fixed effect. So it generates the same result basically. Anyway, so by using this one, we hope to, or we will, rule out all fixed characteristics of individuals. And interestingly, what we see is exactly the same result using panel data as well. These are different. These are based on different first rounds of the first wave of the panel. So, yeah, basically this is based on all first rounds. This is only based on round 4, which is closest in time to the second round, meaning that less other things could have gone on in between, and therefore confound the relationship. And this only focuses on people who stay in the same workplace. And basically, we see consistently the same negative result, even a much stronger one, which I probably wouldn't make too much of, but it's also based on quite a few individuals. But again, the fact that we reproduce the same negative relationship using panel data, I think, is pretty striking. And at least compared to the existing evidence in literature, I think it's relatively strong evidence that there is a negative relationship, and maybe even causal one. Okay, how are we on time?
How much do you need?
Around 50 minutes. Is that 50? No, I'm just kidding. I can do it shorter. I just wanted to wrap this up at least, and then maybe we can decide if we want to. Yeah.
but so there you're showing that the change in contact between
Exposure.
What is the time period?
So the first round of the first wave is 2002, 2003. Second round is 2011. But because it's 3 different rounds of DSS, some of them are surveyed in 2004, 2005, and some are in 2008, 2009.
Okay.
So these are the first rounds, and this is the second round.
Okay, and it's the same individuals.
It's the same individuals.
Yeah, and so you're showing the effect of a change in contact. So
Yeah,
they have more or
diversity.
less contact, and it.
Right. So, like, is there a tendency if an increase in any diversity in your workplace also maps on to lower levels of trust, basically?
Yeah.
Across these different samples, and by the way, it's actually the most trusting ones that lose trust mostly. So, I don't know. I think that's also like an interesting question, an interesting observation, basically. Right.
Do you have places with decreasing diversity?
I think, yeah, that should be, yeah, but probably, I mean, given the general development, it must definitely be, by far most it's going to be increasing. But yeah, we should have that. So you want to
More
split it
trust
up?
there?
I mean, that would be, I mean, it's an interesting question. It might not, I mean, given that most are going to be more ethnically diverse, right? And that's probably driving the relationship, I would imagine. I mean, logically at least. We also have a time fixed effect, by the way, so it takes out the general trend, right? So it's not like it's just that. Yeah, I should probably mention that. But okay, let me just show you this one, and then we can decide whether we want to. I should just show up. Okay, so I've like one key assumption of this approach that I've tried to motivate here is saying that it's important that we use administrative data instead of basically survey data, tapping into contact. And I think it has to do with the way that people like to present themselves in surveys and social desirability in the broad sense. But we can actually gauge that to some extent and validate that assumption because we're using the ESS data, which actually have a measure of people indicating whether they have immigrant colleagues or not. This is what Copenhagen uses in their previous study. So we basically have the subjective measure, and then we know actually whether people have immigrant colleagues or not through the registries, right? And that gives us that's a sort of a productive situation in order to actually understand how this bias that I claim that there might be might actually influence the relationship between editing and trust. So basically what we do is that we take the subjective measure and then we instrument it with the objective measure based on the registry data. Because this will purge all, well, at least much of the measurement error that's associated with assessing this subjectively. So you only use the share of the variation that basically comes from the objective composition of the context. And this shows, I think, something interesting. So first of all, actually, even based on the subjective measure, we also see a negative relationship. It's not, I mean, it's far from significant. It's basically zero, right? But it's like slightly negative. When we instrument that subjective measure with the objective measure from the registry data, they are very highly correlated, which is very reassuring. So obviously, it picks up something important and relevant. But even more importantly, we see the estimated relationship between ethnic diversity and social trust using the subjective measure changing completely dramatically from here to here. We actually end up with a negative, significant negative relationship from a situation that was basically zero to begin with. When we instrument, when we only use the variation in this variable that actually stems from the objective composition of the workplace. So this suggests to us, and I think this is a much larger point that I would like to write something about at some point, that using subjective measures to assess something like contact or other things that are inflicted with various biases or like desirability, I think is very problematic. And I think this is something that's a much bigger challenge to contact literature in general than what's actually been stated in the literature so far. So this basically just suggests that it really changes dramatically if we use the objective data instead of just the subjective one. So this is like the most provocative slides apparently so far. Thomas, do you want to?
In your workplace controls, do you control for like turnover sort of generally in workplace and how?
No, we don't do that. But that's an interesting point actually.
Because right, you can imagine that places where we constantly have to deal with new colleagues, period.
Right.
And those tend to be also places with higher immigrants, so we know that from
Right.
the labor market.
Right. Right. I think, I mean, in a sense, you could say, this is using fixed effect, right? So unless that's something that changes over time, which could be the case, but it's also only looking at the same type of work. You reproduce a negative. But you're right. I think you have a good point. I think also using the sector fixed effect is something that would also pick up that stuff. But it's not a bad point. It's a really good point actually. Is it over?
Are we there?
I have just give me another. I know.
Do you have how many slides before the meta-analysis?
I'm by the conclusion, so can I just wrap it
I'll
up?
keep your questions and
I'm just trying to draw out time and I'll run out. Okay. Anyway, so let me wrap up and conclude, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments and questions. So basically, this extra literature has basically found that there's a negative relationship between ethnic diversity and residential settings on social trust. Does it mean that ethnic diversity will trust? Well, maybe that's a premature conclusion because, by studying residential settings, we also tend to study a special type of interaction or encounter, which tend to be more superficial. Exposure basically doesn't pick up meaningful personalized contact, which is overlooked, which I think is a very fair point. So we basically try to gauge that by looking at the workplace, which we think is a very good, contact-prone setting, so setting prone to actually producing contact between people, to study whether this have the predicted positive effects. This is not what we see. We basically find a robust, significant negative relationship. This holds up to a host of robustness tests, including using panel data and fixed effects. And we also see that it matters beyond the residential context. So when you include residential context, we still observe this negative relationship. So what is the theoretical implications? Well, I think one implication that's important is that contact theory is actually not well suited to explain generalized social trust. I had a review comment on this recently, which is I also thought was fair, saying that, well, this is sort of, analytically maybe the case. You don't even have to show that empirically. But for me, the point is that contact theory is specifically about contact between group members or members of different types, different groups. So it's specifically group connected, whereas generalized social trust is a broad, generalized outlook on people in general. So if you're taking the concept seriously, as I've tried to in the beginning, then I actually don't think it's super logical why contact theory should necessarily have that positive effect. I think it's completely likely that contact theory has these effects in other regards. It just doesn't extend to generalized social trust. anyways, I can speak more about that, but let me wrap up and then, we'll do the meta-analysis, right?
You will see where it goes from here, but
Yeah,
I think you have interesting results to show us too. So let's say about the questions that were.
Right, let's do that. Yeah. Is it all right?
Yeah, so just on the question of how you're constructing this variable of context, is it, you said you're using administrative data and so it's sort of geographically centered, but how likely is it that you're picking up on a big company that has hired immigrants to do the cleaning and they'll never really, or like, what's the precise wording of this colleague that's tapping into?
Right. So one thing we look at, we control for the number of employees, and we also try to condition it on the number of employees. And this is going to be very systematic. Because that was, it's a very good point, it's one of the major concerns that, is it basically driven by large companies? Even though, remember also, we do look at size, so it's not only like, we have some huge companies, right, but people can work in very different sites. There can be segregation within the firm, so to speak. But that's not what we're studying. We're basically looking at the same site. But you're totally right, and like, you can think about this in your own context, who's cleaning in the university, like, do they actually have interactions with professors, for example, right? Not necessarily. So I think, what we do with sectors and basically also conditioning on the number of employees, we'll tap into that to some extent.
Sort of like income brackets, maybe as an alternative or robustness check to.
Right.
So like if you have, junior level entries and.
Right. I mean, we look at the average level of education, which I probably ultimately think is a better proxy than income. But yeah, I mean, you're right. It could be the same thing actually. We thought a lot about what actually to include. So like the first inclination is we should include share of unemployed, but it's probably pretty low in the workplace. I mean, I'm just talking about that's how we typically do it in the residential context, for example, right? So it's a little different, I'd say, in this case. So we think a bit more about what's actually the appropriate controls to include. But yeah, okay, maybe that would be worth doing in these comments. Yeah.
Yeah, my question is very straightforward. At the end of the day, what's the size of the negative effect?
Right.
Because you mentioned that the scales were different, but I mean, yes, it might be statistically significant. What's the size of the effect? On which scale?
Right. I think what is it, like a standard deviation? I'm not 100% sure, but I think off the top of my head, it's something like a standard deviation change in trust. Sorry, in university, changes trust by less than 0.1 points. So on a 0 to 10 scale. So it's pretty marginal, right? It's,
0.1, one standard deviation brings a change.
If I remember correctly.
0.1 on a scale of 10.
Yeah.
So 1%.
Yeah, I guess that's, I would say, that sounds very little, right? But, in general, I would say, in terms of these contextual effects, right, how much can they generally explain of this? You can easily explain a lot of variation trust. You can just include life satisfaction. You can just include all kinds of endogenous variables, right? But that's not a very good strategy in general, right? So I'm not too, in general, I just want to balance this, saying that there is the negative effect, but it's not huge, it's not, And so is this a damning, I think you have to moderate your conclusion, basically. But there is one, and it's not, but I say it's roughly comparable, basically, to what you see in many other studies in that regard. So I don't know.
I think,
2 points. Well, first, I think, the effect is small, but if you have 150 respondents in a fixed effects model, I guess, and if I understand correctly, you're also doing some form of lag dependent variable.
No, it's just fixed effects. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So it's a different way of doing the same, basically. We're trying to address the same problem.
So 2 questions. The first is I didn't understand your instrumental variable strategy, and second, how would you explain your results? Why, in your view, is increasing ethnic diversity decreasing trust in the workplace?
Decreasing trust.
Decreasing trust, yeah.
Right. So do you think that I just respond
I think it's better to answer that.
Okay, right. So the instrumental variable strategy is different than what you typically see. It's a way of purging measurement error instead of a way of trying to induce sort of exogenous variation. Right? So I'm not claiming it's an exogenous. It's just a way of only using the share of that measure that comes from the actual sort of objective composition. It's another line of study where you see this is education, for example. You sometimes see, again, it requires certain type of data to be able to do it right, but you can actually use that to purge a measurement error. And because measurement error would tend to deflate the relationship, that's why we also see a stronger one here. The other one was, why do we see this result? I mean, I think coming back to what I said to begin with, I think it's because basically being around visibly different individuals tend to sort of evoke or maybe prime some of these negative biases we have, and that sort of aggregates up and tend to influence our image of a generalized person. I thought it would be completely, I mean, I was super open when I started this project. I thought it would be completely likely that we find a positive effect and we have like a nice complement to the residential context. But this just seems to suggest that it's something more general, right? And in that sense, you could say it's more worrying, right? It's maybe not so surprising in the residential context. This is a little more, okay, we would imagine that ultimately people develop friendships and so on, and they actually become more trusting, or it doesn't have any effect at least. You actually see the same negative relationship. So I think that exposure that's not necessarily built in with like actual aggressive competition between groups, but just being around people that are different might have. I mean, that's my experience with this. I think you did first.
Yeah, I'm have lots of comments. I'm a big fan of your work, but let me just bring it down to one important point. I think that it is about your framing of this, which you frame it as a test of the contact hypothesis or contact theory. And I know, I guess you know where I'm coming from, but I really don't see the difference to the exposure that you study in the neighborhood context. You're still just studying exposure. You're actually not studying contact per se. And so you actually don't know whether the respondent has any contact at work. Maybe they could work completely alone, or maybe they have a certain hierarchical context that bring them in contact, with people in lower hierarchical positions, or so there's all these differences. So at the end of the day, I still don't see. I mean, I totally believe your result that exposure, when you come to a micro context, there is a slight negative effect. I think you now show this not just for the neighborhood, you show this also for the workplace. This is an important result, but it's not a proof that contact theory doesn't work. And there are lots of other reasons why it actually shouldn't even work at the workplace, because the workplace has a lot of hierarchical situations where the contact theory shouldn't even apply. So anyway, so it's just really about the framing of your findings and what you're claiming here at the end. I think that I'm a little struggling with.
Right. Should I? Yeah. Can I? Okay. This is, we already discussed this to some extent, and I think to pinpoint my biggest problem with contact theory, I don't have any problem with it. Like I said before, I think it's completely likely and plausible that it might have on certain positive effects on outgroup attitudes, but just not on trust. And like you said, there might be good reasons to think why it doesn't have effects on trust. But anyways, my more methodological point with contact theory is that it sort of stacks the card in favor of its own sort of. It's a smart meme in that regard, right? Because it helps itself getting proven all the time. Because you can only study you can only study this by actually asking people about this. And I just showed you that if you study this subjectively, you're gonna find a very different relationship than if you study this by using these objective measures.
Well, there are other ways to study contact in this kind of dormitory setting or whatever. I mean, there are other ways of getting at that, I think, but at least you need to show that there is actual contact behind it.
I mean, I thought what I did to begin with saying that you see that many more, substantially higher share of people have immigrant friends if they work with them and where they live. I think that's an indication that this is sort of something that stems from this relationship. I think it's very problematic to use survey-based measures about whether you're friends with someone. I think it's basically stacking the cards of finding.
I agree, but maybe we need to know more. I mean, this is my last thing I want to say.
No, it's fine. We can discuss.
Maybe we need to know more about what the respondent does at work and with whom they are in contact with, without asking whether they are friends with immigrants and all that. But just to kind of understand more the actual contact people have at work.
Right. I think that's true, and I mean you can think of multiple extensions to this.
Yeah.
So I agree, and I also agree that the field experiments that you're talking about are a very good way of addressing this, right? I probably think that contact theory is a little bit misguided towards at least how I think of generalized trust. That's why I wanted to flesh out how I thought about it to begin with, because this is basically there's a concept creep where you go from generalized social trust to being just basically any kind of trust in any kind of person, and that's not really taking seriously this concept, in my opinion, at least. But yeah, but I buy your argument.
Ready, Lydia was next.
Yeah, so I had two questions, and one that related to what Dinesen was saying, like related to like the types of contact that people have, is then just like more like knowing that people have been in interaction, and you know, one way that you could think about like knowing how positive or negative like the interactions are could be like to look at complaints. Because you have administrative data, so like I know complaints, cases.
I don't think we have those, but yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, but it could be like something like that, like just knowing like more about what has been going on, and just like the proportion of people like being in touch and like making inferences about like how likely they are to be interacting. So for me, it was really to know what kind of contact they have. And the other question I have is like, so what can we learn about from Denmark? Which has a specific history of immigration, a specific political culture, institutional setting, how does this evidence travel? I don't know if like your meta-analysis speaks to that.
Yes, thank you for bringing this up.
So I know, and I knew I was giving you a So one question specifically related to that was also about like the size of the effects. Like, do we have expectations about different sizes of effect, or even like opposite effects in different contexts? Are there thresholds? Are there certain steps? Like, what are your expectations, or what have you found?
Yeah, good question. I would say on the context, this is, you sometimes get this right. It's Denmark, the mere fact that you have this administrative data probably makes it completely not representative of any other country. I mean, I probably don't buy this to begin with, and I would like if I was from Sweden, I would say yeah. Then you're right. Sweden is a complete outlier, but Denmark is super representative of basically most continental Europe. In terms of the debates we have, all the salient features of society, in terms of that I would imagine could potentially, like theoretically at least, impinge on this relationship. In terms of how opposed people are towards immigrants, the fact that we have nationalist right-wing parties for a period of time and so on, like it resembles the rest of Europe much more than Sweden does. So if this was from Sweden, I would say, yeah, okay, you're right, this might be the case. I probably wouldn't, but my point is just this: Denmark is not as idiosyncratic as someone wants to portray. At least if you are open to any country, it's not idiosyncratic. But sorry.
So it's not just like about like saying how Denmark is different, but like how does it generalize?
Okay, I'll give you the answer now. Yeah, you asked for it. So this is a meta-analysis. Basically, that I did with. I should actually say this. It's with William Scheffer, also from University of Copenhagen, Kim Sønderskov, that I've worked with on many of these projects, all of those on Ed University, and it's coming out in annual review of political science. And we have basically collected estimates from all these studies and a lot of other features of the studies to provide an overall estimate of the relationship between university and trust. And this shows the overall relationship. The negative, it's slightly negative. As you can see, most studies by far are negative, but there's also a few positive ones. And like this is also the graph that shows you that Dinesen is a complete unbiased researcher. Because he has the most positive up here, and he has the third most negative down here. So, that really shows he doesn't just pick certain results out. So that speaks to credibility, I think. But anyway, so this is basically stop behaving inappropriately. So this is basically a way of trying to systematize this result. And it's been very time consuming, but also kind of fun to do because you actually get a feel of this by going into all of these. And then if we have time, and we probably don't, but then I can show you variations across different types of trust and types of context and so on. This is also what I wanted to show in relation to your question.
Okay, we'll make a deal. I'll take the questions that are still around, and then if we have a few minutes, you can show us one last slide. So it was Mel, Thomas, and the before, right? Florence, Mel, and then Thomas.
My question is, at the beginning you showed us the aggregate relationship between increase in diversity and trust, which was positive.
Yep.
And so, since you find a negative relationship at the local level, how do you explain this? Is this because workplaces are becoming more segregated in Denmark, which explains why in some contexts are driving the relationship?
This is a super good question. We actually go into this. It's specific question in this piece and think about this, because this is like, it's very thought-provoking, right? And it's also why it's very important to present both pieces of evidence in connection with each other. What I think is the most likely is that there's probably other things that are more important, like not even more important, but much more important than university, right? I would, of course, have fair state institutions, but other people might have other interpretations or other explanations. But I think it probably means that in the Danish case, I would say a fair way of potentially interpreting this would be to say that maybe trust would have increased even more in the absence of the same university. So maybe it would have been 82% or something like that. I don't know. But clearly there's other things that are much more important. But within the country, between micro context, residential, and between workplace context, there's still a tendency for those who are in more diverse / immigrant heavy areas tend to have lower levels of trust.
I have 3 questions.
Okay,
I'll try to be brief. Theoretically, a priori, why would you expect homogeneity to produce trust? That's question 1. Question 2, while I find being able to link an objective measure of diversity to this subjective mass interesting, but I'm wondering if the measurement error there is, if there's something worth doing with that. Like, as in the people who think that their workplace is super diverse and it turns out that it really isn't. I want to know what they think. And I kind of want to know if it's driven by people who are overestimating, say, diversity or something, what's driven by that. And then I'm wondering how much actual overall diversity of the population matters, because people who are foreign-born in Denmark are about 8% of the population. In a country like Canada, it's much higher, to the point where people who are visible, like people of color, are 6% of the Canadian population. So they're not immigrants. They're Canadians who are not white. And so I'm wondering, like, this seems to me like it ought to matter somehow. And so in addition to like not conflating being an immigrant versus being a person of color, like wondering like what population levels do things change, does it not?
Those are some excellent questions. So why is trust higher in more homogeneous settings? It comes back to what I was saying before, but you can elaborate more on it. So basically, I think, it's very well established that people have this, out-group sort of negative bias. People tend to trust less or have more negative, like for example, if messages came in doctors or something like that, you can see people are more at unease when they're around people that identify with different than themselves. So I think, that could also have to do with upholding of norms, greater predictability of behavior, all sorts of potential sort of things that are correlated with looking different. Right? But that probably varies across contexts over time, which you're suggesting in the third comment. And I think this is one of the things that I think it's hard to do empirically because there's not that many candidates, right? Like there's more Denmarks, but there's not that many candidates. But I think it's completely likely that under different historic experience with immigration, then you might not think in so much in group terms, basically, right? And you might not be as sensitive to being exposed to people looking different. Maybe if more people in the aggregate look different, then you don't pay as much attention to the single individual. I mean, there is research on this, but I think it's very, very hard to pass out empirically. But I think this is a likely mechanism, or likely conditioning variables, basically. And I really like the idea the difference between actual and perceived or reported. The problem is it's a very poor measure we have. It's basically that dichotomy. So it's going to have like even a lot of measurement errors to begin with, right? Just from that fact. But I think it would be really interesting actually. The problem is like if you ask people what's the share, that might be quite demanding to ask people. But you might be able to do that. I think you could do that. And also we didn't design the survey. But if I was to do that again, I would definitely do something like that. But I really like the idea because it is picking up something interesting. Also, like the fact that it changes so much indicates exactly that it does pick up something, right? So, anyways, I think that's really interesting. Line of thought to follow.
There were 3 questions. Did you get an answer to 3 questions?
I have a follow-up that I'll say.
Okay, well, then Thomas.
Let me start with I have 2. One a very narrow methodological one. So how do you identify immigrants? Is it by citizenship, by place of birth? How does it work in this?
It's by place of birth.
By place of birth.
Yeah. Okay. And by the way, and this is something that I think most people don't think about Denmark, but I think you might be sort of more skeptical of. But we also use immigrants and descendants basically. So this is typically the way they are classified in the Danish context. So first and second generation immigrants. I have the impression that you might use immigrants and first generation Canadians. Like that. So in Denmark, it's you use that classification in general.
So you also count
most
children of
immigrants
immigrants as immigrants here.
Sorry?
You also count the children of immigrants as immigrants here. Okay. All right. Well, I would think that's a bit of a
Stretch.
Well, but we might still work. I mean,
I'd like to give you some pushback on that, but I'll do that after.
What the more broader question is like, how do we think about diversity? In a way, I don't want to get into a broad debate, but it seems like sort of this in-group, out-group talk like that comes out of these social psychology laboratories has sort of is a bit limiting, I think, if once we go to like the real world context, we live in like nation states, where it's a very specific type of definition of insider and outsider, right? It's not just some arbitrary group or some like ethnic distinction, right? Where it's like, at some point, an ethnic difference may not matter because you're a part of you have multinational, multi-ethnic nation states where you have like very high trust and where ethnic differences don't matter. And you have other cases where these things do matter, right? And I think it's important to keep in mind, especially in the context of when thinking about immigration, right? Because that depends on how we think about this, right? Is it like what is different? Like at some point, at some point, these differences don't matter anymore, and especially if you like lump in the kids of children of immigrants in there, maybe if they speak Danish well enough, and who knows, or maybe naturalized citizens.
Yeah. I'm very engaged in this discussion. We had a great discussion yesterday about this, right? Yeah. And as someone I think put very aptly, like this is an analytical, right? So you say that you're naturalized, but people can't see that, right? Like I'm interested in what people basically observe without having all these kind of sophisticated distinctions that we use as academics. But people don't have that.
But in terms of people can't necessarily see either.
Sorry.
Place of birth isn't visible either.
No, but phenotypically there are differences that I think are quite observable, at least in the Danish case. Probably not to the same extent here, but I'm saying that it's much more likely to matter whether people look phenotypically different than whether they're naturalized citizens or not. And in a sense, you could say just the fact that it does correlate at least is an indication that this is something people pay attention to.
I'm just thinking about your good colleague that we know in common. Like, he would phenotypically be that different? I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't
know what to say. Sorry. Anyway, my point is, so my argument is basically that when we are around people that we observe that look different, that we associate with something, with an outgroup,
yeah, I mean,
that tends to influence how we think about the world, including our trust in other people, to a limited extent, or to some extent. That would be my argument. But,
so I promise you could actually show us one last slide.
Okay.
So I want to make sure you keep your trust.
Yeah, you're trusting you, yeah. Okay, anyways, I'll just show you these very, very quickly. So these divide up trust on the specific type of social trust. So I've been interested in this one, generalized social trust, but there's also trust in neighbors, others, which is residual category, in-group and out-group. And basically what we see is across these measures, there's a negative relationship, right? So this actually indicates that Putnam was, maybe just apart from this, he was more or less right. There's a consistent negative relationship. That being said, so he was right maybe overall, but that being said, there are pretty marked differences across them. Strongest effect is for neighbors, which, this is the next slide I'll show you. This probably makes sense because, we typically measure this in local proximity. There is also an effect for generalized social trust, although it's substantially weaker, right? So we generally see this, but it's more informative vis-a-vis our trust in neighbors than it is for trust in outgroups, for example. The fact that there's not a significant relationship for outgroups, and that it's basically the opposite direction of what we would expect for in-groups, also indicate that group threat theory is not very well positioned to basically explain the relationship to net university trust. This one shows the relationship across different context sizes. So this is basically like relatively small, what we call neighborhoods. So that's basically our type of micro context, and aggregating up to somewhat larger units. That's where we see the largest negative effect. When we aggregate up to municipalities or even regions, so within countries, we still see a negative relationship, but it is not significantly different from the neighborhood. referent. But then when we aggregate up to the country level, where there's of course lots and lots of measurement there, right? Because it doesn't necessarily pick up the type of interaction people might have. We don't actually see a significant relationship. Still negative and all that, but it's not significant. And finally, this one I don't have time for speaking about, but this actually goes into understanding what happens if we specify our models in different ways. What are potential confounding variables, and how does that actually shape the relationship that we get out? I think one takeaway is basically that we see the relationship is robust across all these conditionings, and this is the original relationship. It's generally reduced a little bit, but it's generally highly significant in all cases, independent of the specific strategy we use. And I can say more about that, but I should probably stop at this point.
Thank you very much. We'll have time to get more questions or comments. We still have the room for a while, right? Until 6, right?
Do you want me to go on or like that?
Oh, no, I don't want you to.
Okay, I just wanted to say thank you everyone for your attention and great questions and comments.
So, as the discussion goes, I don't think you have to open it.
Thank you. This is also much. This was what I hoped it was, actually. Thank you very much. I will bring this home. Oh, wow. This is cool. It's a really cool, like, bragging factor.
So Peter brought us a mug from Denmark, so in his luggage, so you can actually fill it with
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. And so there is beer and wine and the water at the back for those who are interested, and I guess there's also going to be some food.